All right, all right, all right. We are live. What's going on, everybody? We don't have the crazy intro like last time. We're just going straight to all face. It's all face today. Welcome to yet another Marxism Today live stream where we'll be talking about ruling class shenanigans and student encampments. There's a lot going on, contradictions within the ruling class. Hunter Biden, Donald Trump, it's going down. All this stuff is happening. So we're going to talk about it and, of course, apply a Marxist perspective to these things, as well as we recently released a video on the student encampment. So we're going to talk a bit about that, hopefully get some good comments about it so we can discuss the video a bit more in depth. And my name is Space, part here of the Marxism Today team. A revolutionary rapper and organizer in Miami, organizing with Art for the People, as well as with RMS, which is going to change a little bit. And we're going to talk about that today as well. A little cliffhanger there. And we already see we got people on Team Hunter Biden. So, looks like we're going to duke that out a little bit as well. But adding to the stage today, because it's not just me talking out today, the illustrious long-haired Thomas. So why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, what's up? It's Thomas from the Marxism Today team and MCU. For those who don't know, MCU, we're a pre-party cadre organization here in the US. We're involved in the union movement. We're involved in the cultural front. We've been doing some stuff on the campuses, doing a lot of different studies. And really an exciting time, I think, for the Maoist movement in the country really getting going. A lot of interest in, just anti-revisionist politics, understanding what went right and what went wrong in the 20th century and the revolutions there. And I think bringing that MLM perspective is really inspiring for a lot of people. So it's been quite exciting. And, for those of you who are familiar with a bit of some of the struggles that played out in Russia in the 1870s, 1880s, there was this period where Plekhanov and then later Lenin and others were fighting against the various distortions of revolutionary theory, Narodnism, legal Marxism. And in a sense, we're kind of in a similar situation today where there's a need for obviously practical work, but there's also a need to wage these ideological and theoretical struggles to win people over to Maoism. And so that's a lot of what we've been doing, and it's been quite exciting. And it's modest, our work still. We've got a long way to go before we develop a party in this country. But yeah, it's exciting, the stuff that's going on in MCU and around the US right now with the working class movement picking up, popular resistance and all that. So I'm excited to talk about the student encampments, talk a little bit about the shenanigans and nonsense amongst the ruling class. And I see Team Hunter Biden. I wonder if there'll be any Team Trump. But in all seriousness, we see the increasing, intensifying contradictions amongst the ruling class. And part of it's, of course, a bit of a dog and pony show with the news media and whatnot, but there are real sharpening contradictions, and that's important for us to take stock of. So it'll be fun to dive into that today, analyze it a bit, and hear what people have to say about it too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I put it in the chat, 2 minutes in, we're talking about Plekhanov. So, there's going to be a good session. We're unpacking this stuff already. And I've been taking part in the summer study, the RMS summer study on the Chinese Revolution that I mentioned at the end of the student encampment video. And I've been equally impressed with kind of the depth of knowledge that this topic has been approached with, really going beyond surface level, as well as the participation in these studies. As somebody who's been trying to start up study groups for a very long time about the Chinese Revolution, getting so much attention to study this, but not only study this, but study it collectively in large groups like that is really encouraging. That I really see both a quantitative and a qualitative shift in terms of how many people are willing to study this stuff and the depth at which people are approaching these topics. So as you can see, we're really we're getting hype. That's just what revolution is. It's getting hype, and more hype, and then you're in socialism. We all know that's the scientific approach to it. But I think it might be helpful to first talk a bit about the student encampment video. Before we do that, Thomas, is there anything you still wanted to mention before we get into it?
No, well, just one thing before we dive into it. You mentioned the summer study that RMS, the Student Mass Organization of MCU, is running. As someone noted, there's like 150 people in the online summer study. That's already a few weeks in. If people want to join, they still can. But and the topic this time is on socialist China, and so learning about the class struggles under socialism and the fight against the capitalist roaders. It's all very interesting stuff. We also will, as MCU, be running some online and in-person MLM studies starting later this summer. So just keep an eye out for those. We'll make an announcement on our website about them. And so that's probably going to get started in about August. So a little ways out. We'll talk about it more as we get closer, send out the curriculum and all that. But keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, just assuming that, if you're on a channel called Marxism Today and you're watching a live stream on Marxism Today, you're going to be interested in trying to apply Marxism to today. So what better way to do that than engaging in collective study? But to get into the student encampments, one, it would be great to see in the comments if any people have any questions about that video, any comments, any criticisms. This would be a great time to talk about that openly. But the key part of this video that I think we really wanted to bring forward is that students are the spark oftentimes in historical movements, right? And Mao said a spark can light a prairie fire, and so students often are that spark. But students are also, it's weird to be a student. It's a strange thing being a student in this society, especially in capitalist society, which means that even though students are a spark, student also have a lot of confusions. And something we're going to talk about is that the less developed the communist movement is and the working class movement, which I should fuse, the more confused students will be. So then if we look at especially US society, it makes sense that student movement here is very confused, which is of course different than in India or the Philippines, for example, where these movements are much stronger and students are operating with much more clarity. So that video is really about the US, but there are some ways that we can see how students have operated in different ways throughout revolutionary movements. And I think China is a really, really great example of this, where you had the May 4th protest, which became a movement where a lot of future communist leaders first had their exposure to Marxism, but also a lot of liberal ideas, right? The May 4th movement, it was very confused. People were very excited. All right, we want to build a strong, independent China. We want to turn against the imperialist powers. We're seeing how we're screwed over by the Treaty of Versailles and World War I. We want a route of independence, but where do we draw this theory from? And so you had Marxism, or some maybe confused confused interpretations of Marxism, liberalism, all this stuff. But people were really grappling, especially students were really grappling with these ideas. So a lot of future communist leaders like Mao, it's one of them, really got their training through this May 4th movement. And so this really launched a general nationwide broad anti-imperialist struggle. But of course, due to the fact that there were students and it was confused, right? The May 4th movement on itself was the spark that, again, really sparked the communist movement. But it wasn't the communist movement itself. And I think that's important to differentiate. Another example of going in China are, the 1935 protests, also known as the December 9th movement, which started with student protests in Beijing, and seeing that the party which was leading China at the time, the Kuomintang, was just letting the Japanese get away with everything. Come, take Manchuria, take everything, just leave us in power. We can work this out. And obviously, the Japanese were really incredibly. I mean, it was imperialism. It was a lot of brutalities against the Chinese people, and so the student movement or the student protests of 1935 again really helped to continue to spark anti-Japanese movement. But the difference between the 1935 movement and the movement of 1919 is that by 1935 you had, right, a strong communist party. You have had more of a workers movement already, and of course mainly a peasant movement. Lots of both economic and political struggles, and communists with base areas, right, being actually in control of different parts. And so the student movement then helped to broaden and widen that struggle and bring it to all sections of society. So again, being the spark, but not the leaders. And even after socialist transition, this is really interesting. After socialist transition and the Cultural Revolution, okay, by that time we have socialism already, students still play an important role by bringing the Cultural Revolution, first to the workers and to the peasantry, later to the peasantry, later in 1966. And what you see there, what is really important is that some students really see themselves in that role of we're spreading this around, we're spreading how important it is to struggle against capitalist voters to deepen the socialist transition. That was incredibly important. While there were also other sections of students that were like, oh, we're leading this. Guess we're the leaders of this revolution now. It's the students, we're the next vanguard, which led to a lot of fairly ugly situations where really a lot of confused ideas reigned supreme. So all these are just some historical examples of the Chinese Revolution, of how students were the spark. But we see this in a country like France as well, with the
Space.
19th.
Let me just jump in real quick before we go on to France.
Sure.
I just want to ask you a little bit about the stuff in China, because even when there was an advanced revolutionary movement there, and the students in 1935 or in socialism, they really sparked resistance. Even then, one of the things was and maybe you were planning to get to this, so sorry if I'm jumping the gun a bit, but once the students went amongst the workers, the peasants, they often realized, despite sparking things, despite having a lot of great ideas, that they had to transform a lot. They had to learn what it meant to really serve the people, to join up with the struggles of the oppressed masses, especially those students from more elite universities. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, but that may be jumping the gun here a little bit in terms of what you're planning to talk about.
No, that's a great point to really bring up, because that's something that Mao talked a lot about, Chinese comrades talked a lot about with students, with intellectuals, how important it was to really immerse yourself in the struggles of the working class and the peasantry, and to learn from it. And that the only way to transform yourself, to use this knowledge that you've been learning for it to really serve the people, you needed to transform yourself, which meant immersing yourself in the struggles and learning from the proletariat and the peasantry, which you can't do by pretty much just telling the peasant, trying to lead these struggles, right? You need to actually learn. And that process was very important to engage in, and it's still important for us now, because the question is, just making that link, and we'll talk more about that later too. What does it mean to be a student now? Okay, great. There's all this past class struggle that we can learn from. But what does it mean to immerse yourself in the working class? Because we don't have the peasantry in the US. So what does it mean to remold yourself, to change your entire world outlook, to change how you view your place in society as a student, being in this kind of transitional period in your life, where you really have to make a key decision of, am I going to try and become part of the bourgeoisie, part of the petty bourgeoisie, or really immerse myself, learn from the working class, and join up with the working class movement? So that's a bit of a broad general overview there. But Thomas, I also wonder whether you had any more specific instances you wanted to talk about a bit as well.
Well, in terms of the stuff in China, yeah, I think there was just, students, especially at the best universities, especially before socialism, but as you noted, the problem continued into socialism, generally had an idea that they should really be running the society, or at least have a say in how societies run, which has a positive and a negative aspect, because as you noted, sometimes students would have an arrogant attitude towards the workers and the peasants. But reading through, for example, William Hinton's book, The 100-Day War, you really see the best and the worst. You see the factionalism and the petty fighting that certain students took up, but that was really a small subsection overall that were really committed to that. In general, the majority of students were quite serious during the Cultural Revolution, especially in the early Red Guards period, about advancing the revolution and learning from the peasants and the workers. And a lot of them went, and when they got to the villages in China, they were so humbled because they would go to the villages thinking, okay, we know so much, we're young, we're strong, we've marched across the country. And then they would get there and realize that they could only initially do the amount of labor that generally the elderly, the infirm, and small children would do. And that was quite a humbling experience to say, wow, this is where our food comes from. This is hard work. And the peasants were generally so kind and thoughtful. Like, don't worry, it takes some time. You've got to adjust, And so some of the students, of course, would not take that seriously or kind of not want to do hard work, but a lot of them did. And they saw how they transformed. Many of them settled down in the villages. And there's an excellent article by Yan Myrdal about in this village, Liuling village in Shanxi in northwest China, about one of the students who settled down there. And then she was not only learned a lot from the peasants, but also helped to spearhead the movement for collective childcare as part of the emancipation of women. So you can see what's possible in terms of the student movement when students really spark resistance, spark uprisings, then go join the people, learn from the popular struggles, in China's case, the peasants and the working class, in our case, the working class, and that kind of dialectical interplay that happens. It's quite profound. And that's something really for the student movement in the US to take stock of.
Yeah, there's, of course, the link there of if you're not used to really doing work, how much work would you be able to do that the proletariat engages in every day? So I appreciate that. I think that's those concrete examples are very interesting and helpful for us to draw from. And so taking that and going kind of back to that general principle of students as a spark, for example, in 1968 there were student protests really all over the world. But the reason why the student protests in May 68 in France, notably in Paris, is so interesting is that the student protests there sparked a general strike of workers, the estimates between 8 and 9 million workers, which just want to take a second for everybody to think about that. Imagine student protests here in the US. Imagine if the student encampment protest here sparked 8 to 9 million workers on strike. This stuff happened at the time, but we can't just say, okay, well, the students went out on the street and then that happened, or so, because you could draw the lesson from that in the US, well, the students just didn't hit the streets hard enough. We just needed more students. We needed the students to be more militant, more barricades, all this stuff. So we have to look at what are the conditions whereby some student protests spark these wide general political protests, these economic struggles of the working class, and some don't. So we have to look at, well, what are the conditions under which this happens? And so something that's really important is that in France at the time, for example, although the unions at the time were really under leadership of the PCF, which by that time was a pretty terrible party, there was still a high level of degree of organization and legacy of decades of struggle of the working class that have been fought for and organized by the communists for a long time. So that stuff didn't just kind of fall out of the air or was sparked by the students, right? Those were communists engaging in the working class and advanced workers, really setting up big unions like that. The students didn't do that. So there was already a base for the students to tap into. The same thing goes for China in 35, where you have communists who gave everything, their entire lives, to set up these base areas where you already had decades of peasant rebellions that were organized by the communists, as well as strikes, especially in the 1920s by the working class, that the students were then able to tap into. So to take that and then to look at our conditions now, where we basically really lack both a strong communist movement and a strong working class movement, that the students could be sparking all they want, but if there's no fluid in the lighter, then you can spark, but a flame is not going to come out. And so that is really the key message that we were trying to bring across with this video, that yes, students, knowingly and willingly facing a lot of repression, there's a lot of courage and bravery involved in that. You see terrible genocide going on, and you're like, I have to do something. I'm going to go out there. Like, that's a very sensible response to have. That is a much better response to have than being like, all right, I'm just going to continue to watch stuff here. So the fact that we saw students all over the country seeing that this is terrible, I'm going to go in action. I'm going to be out here in some cities in the cold, knowing that the police could come and raid us anytime, watching other camps get raided, knowing that that can happen to you. That's not something that we can just ignore or push to the side. That is very important. It's this very important barometer to kind of measure, well, where are students at in this country? And so the fact that students are willing to act is incredibly important. And so, when we talk about more of some of the political shortcomings of this encampment, it's very important to do that from that framework of unity, struggle, unity. That obviously there's so much to unite with here with the students. And that when we struggle through some of these general ideas, it's because we want students to be the spark, right? To really light these broader struggles. But in order to do that, we generally need two things. One, we need more of political clarity amongst students, but we also need, well, I guess, three things: a strong communist movement and a strong working class movement. Of course, the ideas, all these should be connected. And we could talk a little bit more about what that means. But I wanted to see, Thomas, I know you've been looking through the comments a little bit. Is there anything that stood out to you or something you would want to talk about, or should we go more into what some of those general confusions have been amongst the campuses?
Well, there's a few great questions about broader points about history in the chat, but I think we should maybe get into some of those a little later on and talk about the encampment stuff first. And just to ask you a follow-up question, it was really interesting to hear the interviews you did with students from different campuses around the country. One of the things that stood out was just some of the typical ideological confusions on the campuses. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on them. You classified these in the video broadly as petty bourgeois radicalism. Could you talk about both some particular confusions and also just the historical trend of petty bourgeois radicalism and a little bit how that's playing out right now in the US?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's a great question, because we probably mentioned petty bourgeois radicalism a million times in the video while doing our best to define it, of course. But, I think a very helpful framework for petty bourgeois radicalism is to criticize the system from within the system, right? We could actually phrase that in different ways. We could phrase that as criticizing capitalism from a petty bourgeois class standpoint rather than a proletarian class standpoint. The tricky thing with petty bourgeois radicalism is that a lot of what is put forward is either correct or sounds correct. And so Wyatt in the video kind of touches on this. Well, it's a little petty bourgeois radicalism is a bit all over the place, so it can be a bit of a slippery fish, difficult to hold on to. So I think getting some of these concrete examples will help to solidify this stuff. Something that Ari talked about in this video were the impacts of NGOism, kind of this mutual aid logic to our political projects that were happening across campuses. So on a campus, you see something bad happening, the genocide in Palestine. We need to speak out against that. Well, what's the purpose of that? We're gathering together, we're building unity to influence the campus, the society, the world at large, right? So this is from all levels, a political struggle. So it would make sense for the first step to be, well, what are our political points of unity? What is it that we agree on? What do we want to talk to people about? What message are we sending out there? Obviously, some of these things need to be broad, especially if we want to reach a whole campus or beyond the campus, a city. It's fine if these political principles are a bit broad, but we should be very clear and, more importantly, spend some time to really struggle through these political ideas together. And instead of doing that, there were the questions of how are we going to manage donations, how are we going to organize food, a lot of other, logistical questions. So we could say, okay, well, we need to feed people. We need to figure out these logistical questions. And that is absolutely true. But if the purpose is to wage somewhat of a political struggle, then there's no reason why those political struggles wouldn't be able to be waged first, to set up of like, well, what are we even feeding people for? What is the political basis to set up here? And the other issue is that a lot of times what is put forward is, well, we'll get to these logistical questions first, then we'll get into the political stuff. But basically what tends to happen is that those political questions are kind of postponed indefinitely. And that is the key thing here. Not like, well, do we discuss logistics in the first hour, then politics in the second hour, but really that we need to focus on building the political unity first, and then we can, use those political principles to guide all these other logistical questions. So it's really a question of having politics in command. But then we have to ask the question. Go ahead, Thomas.
Let me just say on that point, and I think what we saw is when those sort of political discussions and debates were largely deferred or put off or just didn't really happen so much in some of the encampments, the default, well, the tendency was to default to the prevailing liberal radical politics of the day. And you mentioned some of this in the video, but like divest, which is a demand wholly within the capitalist system. And disclose too, which is still within the capitalist system. It's not necessarily a bad demand in and of itself, but if that's the limit of the demands, then obviously, that is the prevailing ideology of the bourgeoisie, or to an extent, the petty bourgeois radicals.
Yeah, that's such a key point. It's really, what are we defaulting to, especially if we don't have a scientific analysis of society or past political struggles to really analyze, take their strengths and overcome past shortcomings, and really charting a new path forward. So this whole idea of really focusing on those kinds of logistical questions, deferring on political questions, really meant that there was a like I said, defaulting to whatever was dominant politically, and that has been petty bourgeois radicalism historically. And to really understand this, it's important to really look at what happens when you're a student, right? A lot of times, especially in the US, you move away from home, you're kind of in a completely new environment, or you might stay on the campus surrounded by students. It really tends to be a fairly big break from life at high school. And all of a sudden, you're introduced to so many different political ideas. It can be a bit dizzying, but what happens is a lot of times it's surface level political ideas, right? You kind of get this little platter, a little sample platter. You can take a little bit from everything, but you're not encouraged to go deeper, to turn your sample into a whole meal, right? It's you kind of continue on this surface level. So you get the impression of like, wow, I'm a student. I'm really engaging with all these ideas. I'm really figuring out for myself what my position is in the world, how to engage with the world, and of course, what class standpoint I'm adopting. So what tends to happen is that people have this sense of, we're criticizing the system, which is true, because in a lot of college campuses there is a lot of talk about capitalism and what capitalism is and some of the shortcomings of capitalism, right? It's what they call the shortcomings of capitalism, and an analysis of these things. But that could then give the impression that, well, this is just how we move beyond capitalism. We just keep criticizing it. We keep talking about the shortcomings. We keep talking at a very broad surface level, all the movements that have been against capitalism, right? There's not really a talk about communism or socialism as a transition. It's all this either pro-capitalist stuff or anti-capitalist stuff. It gives the impression that I'm really turning myself against this system. And that's the tricky thing, that petty bourgeois radicalism a lot of times has valid and valuable criticisms of the system. Because if we look at the opposite, let's say there wouldn't be any petty bourgeois radicalism on campuses, right? In some ways, they'll be worse because then just nobody is talking about capitalism, and it's very hard for us to have these points of intervention. So, of course, we want these criticisms to be brought up. It's very important. However, if you do not have a scientific Marxist approach, what that means is that you're not thinking in terms of class struggle or revolution, right? Revolution is something that we can define, right? A violent act whereby one class overthrows another, a seizure of power by one class overthrows another, which means that we can analyze it historically, which means that it's a real material force, and that all of our questions of what we're doing now relates to this question of revolution. That's a very scientific approach. Petty bourgeois radicalism gives you the illusion that you're doing that, but actually you're either covering up the question of revolution, sidestepping the question of revolution, or actually putting forth that we don't need a revolution at all, which are different things. But all of these lead to the same point, which is not treating revolution as a science. And that is promoted by the ruling class in many different ways. But Thomas, I'm sure you have a couple of things to add to that as well.
Well, I think you were quite comprehensive in your answer, to be honest. But yeah, I think just we see kind of the student encampments, and there was a lot of positive stuff there. I think the video you made really did an excellent job kind of with this dialectical perspective, highlighting the positives while also critiquing the shortcomings. But one of the shortcomings was, in a lot of ways, the US left has been mired in this same tactic since Occupy, of grab a public space, hold on to it, try to coordinate logistics to defend it, and then inevitably face the police clearing. And you know, it's not so possible as a bunch of students to, if the state really wants to evict you, to really duke it out with them. You know, I mean, people could, get beat up and, fight back, but it doesn't generally accomplish so much. Unfortunately, people get dragged out, some get arrested, and they're courageous for doing that. But in terms of that being a effective strategy overall to bring about social change, it's not. It can be an effective tactic as part of a larger strategy. And I think what we've seen is really the successes of this tactic and the real strategic limitations of this approach. And therefore, as you put it, there has to be a serious scientific approach to studying history, to studying social change, and to understanding that unless the class of people who are by and large reproducing the society, the working class, namely, take up these ideas, and not the petty bourgeois radical ideas, but the ideas of understanding the root cause of the oppression and exploitation they face, really take up Marxism, then we'll remain mired in these forms of petty bourgeois radicalism, which have shown not only that they are actually impotent in terms of changing the status quo, but they're also unable, generally speaking, with a few exceptions, to stop things from getting worse. Because if we're honest, things are not staying static, right? Like, one basic law of dialectics is that change is constant. So the current development of the US empire is a death spiral. Maybe death spiral is a bit overstated, but it's a downward trend. We're seeing increasing inter-imperialist competition. We know there's a rhythm to capitalist production, which leads to major economic crises. There's some debate if one's currently on the horizon, or if maybe we're even heading into a major inflationary crisis as well. Given those circumstances, we know inevitably the ruling class will bring, and they're already kind of openly talking about bringing new repressive measures. And so, given that reality, there's a quite desperate need almost for the movements to get beyond their current limitations, to take up this scientific approach of Marxism, to really understand the way in which revolutionary transformation of society is made. Because it's easy to say you're against capitalism if you're on the left on a campus or in different circles today. It's a good thing to say it, don't get me wrong, but it's easy to say it. It's much harder to understand what capitalism really is as an economic and political system, or the various political kind of superstructures that are built upon capitalism, different forms of the state that preserve bourgeois class rule, and then to understand how to change the world and really overthrow the capitalist class. And once the student movement historically has taken stock of that, they have really acted as that spark. Even if the fuel or the prairie, to draw from Mao's "a single spark can start a prairie fire," it is meager at the time. It is possible for the students to then become the bearers of Marxism to the working class, to go amongst the workers, to link up with their struggles, to explain to them the root cause of their oppression and how they can overcome it. And again, to draw on the analogy of Russia in the 1870s and 1880s, that's precisely what the early Russian Marxists did. They struggled intellectually over the non-Marxist theory. Lenin once called Narodnism the particular Russian form of revisionism. And they also struggled via various study circles they got started to explain to the advanced workers who were already fighting various struggles against the capitalists on the economic front, to explain to them the root cause of their oppression, the link between their fight and the fight against Tsardom and against capitalism. And all of this led to the sort of intellectual ferment that advanced both the working class movement and the communist movement, and led to the creation and the founding of was at that point called the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, but was really the Marxist party that Lenin and others helped to create in Russia. And so, one of the most positive aspects of these encampments, I think, somewhat ironically, is that coming out of them, a bunch of people are going to be asking, well, why did these fail? Because they weren't able to stop the genocide. They did a lot of positive stuff, but the genocide continues and is intensifying. And inevitably, just like after George Floyd, when people are grappling with, okay, I was involved in this protest movement, it was quite positive, radicalizing, transformative, I felt empowered, but also defeated. Why did we get defeated? Why weren't these movements able to go further than they were? People start to look for answers that provide a more clear and coherent and scientific explanation than what they received in petty bourgeois radical circles. And inevitably, and we saw this after George Floyd, we saw it after Occupy, we'll see it even more now after these encampments, people will turn towards Marxism to understand what really went wrong and how they can avoid repeating those same mistakes. And I think what we've already seen, for example, in the summer study with RMS, is a huge number of people who are like, I was involved in these protests. How do we do better next time? How do we go further than we were able to do? Why didn't we have the social power and social force of compulsion, as Marx calls it, to really stop the ruling class? And look, short of a revolution, if there's a strong enough working class and popular movement, it's entirely possible to stop the bourgeoisie from doing things they want to do. For example, when Marx and Engels were living in London, the British ruling class wanted to intervene in the US Civil War on the side of the South to preserve slavery because of the interest the British ruling class had in the cotton production as the center of textile production in the world. And through various mass protests and demonstrations, Marx and Engels, with others, were able to help stop that effort to support that the British ruling class wanted to support itself. They were able to stop that. So even short of revolution, it is possible for the working class movement, in conjunction with other popular classes in society, to join together to force the ruling class's hand to stop with one oppressive policy or another. And I think if we take stock of that, we can see what the stepping stones towards a revolution are. because it can be daunting to say, we're here, these encampments got defeated, how do we get to revolution? That seems pie in the sky. Well, it's not. But we have to study history to really understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just remembered that Jay told me to stop saying absolutely after this. So I'm sorry, Jay. I know you're not watching, but I still apologize. Just train in me years of listening to podcast brain. So I'm saying not absolutely, but the way that the ruling class is, as this movement is getting bigger, as more people are grappling with Marxism, the ruling class is going to work overtime to come up with all these distortions of Marxism. And we've seen that after the 68 protests and after the Black Panthers in the US and some other communist formations, this very intensive promotion of postmodernism. But what was interesting is that some of these tactics, like identity politics, aren't working so well anymore, or they're shifting a bit, which is really interesting to see. For example, Ari in the interview talked about how previously at protests of Safe People's Park, identity politics was used heavily to basically discredit a Marxist position. Now, what she saw with the student encampments is that really wasn't, it was kind of not done. Like if you were putting forward like an argument that was completely based on identity, people saw through it. And so on the one hand, we can say, okay, well, that's great because identity politics is terrible. And maybe somebody in the chat could do a quick exposure against identity politics. That would be great. But the ruling class is not going to say, well, okay, we tried, we put forward identity politics, didn't work now, and so we're just going to let things run their course. No, there's going to be these continuous different distortions of what Marxism is. And a very important place, kind of injection point of those distortions are through radical academia. And what we see now is that there is a huge section of academia that is completely focused and tied to exposing how bad academia is. And it's the same thing with nonprofits, that there is a section of nonprofits that is geared towards tackling the nonprofit industrial complex, right? To deal with the problem of nonprofits, we just need one more nonprofit, just one more nonprofit than all nonprofits. Definitely going to work this time. And so we need to be very careful and mindful of those different kinds of distortions of what of the ruling class. And one of those things, one of the very important things, and Thomas, maybe if you could already start thinking about some other distortions that you've seen, but one that I really wanted to highlight is still really tied to this question of revolution, of what revolution is. Because where identity politics is becoming a little less popular, I've seen many more distortions of revolution. And this whole idea of revolution is self-care is revolutionary, I don't see that as being put forward as much anymore. But for example, that the student encampments are the revolution, and that is really pushed, that actually us being here on this encampment is making revolution. It's like, no, it could be a very important point in the revolutionary process, but the encampments themselves aren't the revolution. And so I think for people who consider themselves revolutionaries, when people say revolution, to get a sense of what they mean by that, and to put forward some very clear definitions to kind of combat these bourgeois distortions, because now we're going to have a very important section of academia and nonprofits calling for revolution. Say, yes, we agree with you, communists. We do need a revolution. And that's why we need to vote for free healthcare, because that's how the revolution starts, or that is the revolution. And these sorts of confusions. But there's so many of these distortions that we're dealing with. So Thomas, if you could maybe speak to another favorite of yours that you've heard.
Yeah, well, there really are a lot. I'll actually mention one that came, a historical one. that came in a very late stage of the development of the revolutionary movement in Russia. The Mensheviks and the right wing of the socialist revolutionaries, the kind of followers of kind of what had been Narodnism earlier, they argued they needed to defend the revolution from the Bolsheviks and then support the provisional government, which, for those who don't know, after the February Revolution in Russia, there was a provisional government set up. It was a bourgeois government. It quickly re-entered the World War, and was setting Russia kind of exactly on the same path that they had been on under the Tsar in many respects. And they would, the members of that government included many pseudo-socialists, fake socialists, social opportunists who supported the war in one way or another, and argued to protect the revolution, they had to stop the Bolsheviks, who were the genuine communist revolutionaries actually fighting to overthrow this bourgeois government and establish socialism. And so, I mentioned that example just to show to the ends which the bourgeoisie and various bourgeois forces and agents will go to, in the midst of a crisis, promote the bourgeois politics and the status quo in the name of, they may even call it supporting the revolution. In our current moment, the identity politics stuff is waning to some degree, but it's still, the postmodern stuff is tremendously influential. And we can see this, in the way that various aspects of conversation continue to be shut down. We can also see it in the just lack of willingness to grapple with the importance of the working class movement in this country. Because, we actually saw in a number of locals and unions, for example, resolutions around Palestine being put forward. This is quite significant, actually, that some subsection of the working class movement and workers were thinking about, how do we link our struggle up with the Palestinian struggle and take a stand in support of the Palestinian people. But actually what was circulating at that time, in this very important moment of kind of revival of the working class movement and grappling with kind of anti-imperialist consciousness in the working class movement, was a whole series of theories that students are actually the most revolutionary class. And you had alluded to this earlier, Space. But the idea, and it's very typical amongst intelligentsia, that they're actually the most radical. And what we see kind of with the petty bourgeoisie and petty bourgeois radicals in general is they are defined by their contradictory class position. On the one hand, they're oppressed by capitalism and really kind of put in often quite uncomfortable positions, downward social mobility, and so on. On the other hand, they do benefit from it. From capitalism, even when they're being screwed over by it. And so the petty bourgeois radicals often oscillate between various forms of opportunism that aim to preserve the status quo through really reformism. And of course, we want reforms, but reforms need to be a stepping stone to a revolution, not goals in and of themselves. But we see petty bourgeois radicals tend towards just supporting reforms as the end goal, maybe even calling those the end of capitalism. But on the other hand, we see the real left adventurism amongst a subsection of the petty bourgeois radicals, tendencies to just kind of fetishize, violent actions or confrontations with the police as the key answer, things like that. And this is what Lenin called the kind of the politics of the disgruntled intelligentsia. It's very typical. And that sort of tendency quickly eliminates a mass base. You have a lot of support, and then you have a group like the Weather Underground, and people support even revolutionary transformation, but they don't support the sort of stuff the Weather was doing, for example. And so there's a need to understand and take stock of, the way in which petty bourgeois radicalism at times puts forward not only right opportunist tendencies that seem, and they frame as revolutionary, but also left adventurous tendencies, which can really harm the movement in key ways through promoting dangerous and absurd actions or politics. And we saw that in particular with historically in the last decade or so, with the tendency for petty bourgeois radicals to be unwilling to work with or win over wavering or middle forces in the society. Basically, the idea, if you're not already radical, it's not worth our time. And of course, we don't want to waste our time like trying to win over diehard rightists. But given the low level of consciousness and class consciousness in this country, a lot of people will inevitably kind of be relatively unaware or not have a firm and good stand on a lot of political issues. We have to win them over, especially amongst the working class.
Yes, and also for the record, I'm the one who pinned the Thomas's cute comment. That wasn't Thomas trying to lift.
Yeah, it was a little distracting all of a sudden. I was like, what is going on right now?
So great. It was so great. I threw you a curveball and you handled it so well. It did not miss a beat. No, that was really great. Well, I think we definitely got a lot out of this discussion around students and petty bourgeois radicalism. And if you're okay with it too, Thomas, I think it might be good to start getting into some of these ruling class shenanigans.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think this section might be good just to preface a little bit. Oftentimes, amongst the revolutionary left, there's a correct rejection of the two-party system. Like both parties serve capital, like the Democrats and Republicans, they both suck, right? And we're reasonably, I think, so tired of hearing all this nonsense of lesser evilism. You got to support the Democrats because if, Republican gets elected, we're going to lose all the great things we have. And then you see on the abortion question, like Obama and Biden could have done something about it, but they didn't because they want to use that as their electoral, vehicle. So this whole lesser evilism thing, most of the revolutionary left, and I'm using that term loosely, but in the US is tired of this nonsense of lesser evilism, and rightly so. But there can be a tendency to kind of, in noting that both parties serve capital, overcorrect and say both parties are just the same, or the contradictions amongst the parties is just a sideshow. And there's an element of it, it is a bit of theater to distract people from a lot of issues. There is the promotion of the culture wars, which do deal with real social issues, but then become a kind of topic of fixation to distract people and divide the population. But I think that we do also need to see that, insofar as we have a system, and I know you put out a song on this, of $1, one vote, the bourgeoisie does use the bourgeois democracy and the politicians and the political system to serve their interests. And therefore, the contradictions between different political candidates and different political parties, or the two main parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are at a certain level expressions of contradictions amongst the bourgeoisie. And if we don't take stock of this, we end up with a very naive view of the ruling class as a unified and kind of undivided boogeyman who's all controlling, maybe all powerful, maybe revolution's hopeless. And I think people probably wouldn't agree with that, but it can go down that line of reasoning very quickly. And in contradiction to that view of things, I think we can see that the contradictions amongst the ruling class are intensifying quite significantly right now. The most clear and evident example of this is the fact that what's known as the gentleman's agreement between the ruling class parties is breaking down. Now, what do I mean by the gentleman's agreement? What I'm referring to is the sumptuary law, the unstated social reality that any president won't face prosecution for the crimes they commit. And generally, politicians won't either unless they're particularly egregious. But this has changed now. Even the first time when Trump got elected, Obama, Hillary, all of them come out and said, peaceful transition of power, peaceful transition of power. We don't like Trump, but peaceful transition of power. But now, the Biden administration is very clearly making a concerted effort to send Trump to jail. And no one's going to shed any tears for Trump. Like if he goes to jail, great, whatever. But, of course, liberals believe that him going to jail will save democracy. That's nonsense. But the fact that the Biden administration and significant sections of the ruling class who back the Biden administration want to see Trump in prison shows how intense the contradictions are amongst the ruling class. This is a typical thing you see in poor and oppressed countries that, one person gets elected and they put the person they just beat and ousted from office. That person gets sent to prison. And now we're having that. And Trump has basically promised to do the same to Biden if he gets into office, that Biden will be under investigation for his crimes. And it does seem like, Biden has committed a number of crimes in terms of similar things to what Trump has done with secret classified documents. Also, this whole thing with the Burisma and money laundering seems to have some substance to it. And I'm not talking about presidents sending, other presidents to jail for war crimes, because every single one of them should be in jail for that. That's not the type of crimes we're talking about here. But it's an interesting shift. When Nixon broke the law, he was pardoned, and that was a relatively cut and dried thing. That was 50 years ago, and now the situation's different. The ruling class is fairly openly talking about imprisoning their enemies within the ruling class. Now, I don't think we're anywhere towards close to a civil war, and these sort of intensifications of contradictions amongst the ruling class don't mean we're on the eve of revolution. If you look at Mexico or Pakistan or other countries, it's typical not only for politicians who get out of office to be put in prison, but during election cycle for hundreds of politicians and family members to be killed. And there's still neither Pakistan nor Mexico is on the eve of a revolutionary situation. So I want to keep that perspective, because in the US, given the long-term stability of the ruling class, the bourgeois class rule, it's easy to kind of think, oh, these intensifications mean we're on the verge of revolution. They don't, but they're very important to take stock of. And even not just with Trump, but everything going on with Hunter Biden with this gun charge. For those who aren't familiar, Hunter Biden was just convicted of illegal possession of a firearm. Namely, one of the key things was that he testified that he was not addicted to illegal drugs when he was in fact addicted to crack and maybe meth when he purchased the firearm. And it seems he'll at least do some prison time, potentially up to 25 years. But I don't think he'll get the maximum sentence. And Lil Wayne got 1 year for imprisonment for illegal firearm possession. We might see something more like that with Hunter Biden. So I could talk more broadly about what these contradictions represent, but I guess I'll just give two things here that is important to see underlying these contradictions, and then we can dive into a few different aspects of this. The first is that the existing political parties are in a major crisis of legitimacy. I mean, Trump's victory in 2016 showed that. The Republican Party is pretty, stupid, like the ruling class parties. And so in 2016, when voter sentiment amongst Republicans was an all-time high in terms of, anti-establishment sentiment amongst Republican voters was at an all-time high, they tried to run Jeb Bush as their chosen candidate. He had over $100 million of donations in his kind of electoral coffers before 2016 even started. And he was like the most pro-establishment candidate. That fell apart. The Republicans couldn't put forward a viable candidate they initially wanted. Trump kind of was able to just eviscerate the other candidates in debate, and by appealing to being an outsider. And Republicans had to settle on him, although many of the Republican old guard were very unhappy about it. The Democrats are likewise facing a crisis of legitimacy, and the ruling class system as a whole is. It's a slow-growing crisis. It's not a full-blown one yet. But they have to adjust their form of class rule because of the growing popular anger. And they also have to adjust their form of class rule because of the increased competition with China, where the system of neoliberal trade relations, market deregulations, opening of doors for capital investment, and so on, that system, which worked very well when the US was the sole superpower in the world in the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, no longer works well, where China has arisen as not only a major imperialist competitor, but in a meaningful sense, a peer competitor with the US. And China, for example, has won a whole bunch of cases against the United States in the World Trade Organization. China has kind of monopolies capable of competing toe-to-toe with American companies like Huawei and others. And so the US has to abandon, and the ruling class is abandoning, these neoliberal policies. Some are advocating for a rapid abandonment and a shift towards protectionism. Others are advocating for a more slow abandonment or a partial abandonment. And these contradictions are intense. Various businesses stand to lose tens or more billions of dollars. And all of this is being reflected in the electoral arena as well, where they're very intent on making sure they get their fair share, as they see it, of the pie of the wealth that the workers of the world create. So all of that is sort of various aspects of the material basis for these conflicts amongst the ruling class, which are much, much, much less about democracy versus fascism, as the Democrats claim, or, America first versus globalist communism, as Trump frames it. Uh, so hopefully that's helpful. I don't know, Space, if you have any comments or follow-up questions.
Yeah, Elijah put forward, Democrats tend to subvert revolutionary organizing slightly more covertly. Biden trying to control the union movement and making it friendlier to capitalism is an example. And of course, we know Biden's the president who supported the union movement the most, eating ice cream with all the big union guys. And so I was wondering, Thomas, if you could address this comment a bit.
Yeah, well, it's certainly true that since the New Deal, the Democratic Party has been generally the party most closely aligned with the reactionary union leaders. Prior to the New Deal, it was a bit more divided. Like John Lewis, who headed the United Mine Workers of America, one of the big unions, was very close to the Republican Party. But since the New Deal, the Democrats have really maintained a close alliance with the union leaders. But this is actually breaking down a little bit in the sense that a significant chunk of the union base, for example, in UAW, of the members who vote, around 45% were saying they're going to support Trump in this election, which is pretty big shift. And similar things are playing out in a lot of unions, the ILA, the longshoremen of the East Coast, the building trades, Teamsters, and we also see this, not just amongst white workers, this is commonly misunderstood, but also amongst Black and Hispanic workers. There's a growing popularity of Trump, and that's a complicated thing. Of course, a lot of people also don't vote and don't really care about either candidate. But amongst those who do vote and amongst the unionized workers, there's a growing popularity of Trump and the Republican Party. And this is because the Republicans, and Trump in particular, have made a lot of overtures to the unions, promised to help them preserve American jobs, and really see the unions correctly, I think, as they need the reactionary union leadership to support these policies of reindustrializing, bringing back a lot of industrial production to ensure the smooth flow of production in the United States. And so, it's not just Trump, but also people like Marco Rubio, who, for example, published a statement supporting Amazon organizing in Bessemer, Alabama. It's quite a different thing than the party of Mitt Romney now, the Republicans. They're really trying to court the union leaders and some of the union members. And this is very important to take stock of because it's reflecting some major changes in how both parties articulate their politics. As the Democrats increasingly shift their base away from a lot of the unionized workers into more of the urban intellectuals, especially in the coastal cities, and the office workers. And also went over a section of more conservative suburban voters. So it'd be very interesting to see how this shakes out in terms of if Trump and the Republicans are able to win over the support of a number of unions. Sean O'Brien, the head of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, has met with Trump a number of times and is really flirting with endorsing him. I don't know if he ultimately will, but he may well. It seems like Trump is going to try to win over the support of the international longshoremen on the East Coast, the ILA, as well as the building trades. And Trump wanted to go to the UAW picket line, actually. And then there was some maneuvering behind the scenes, and Biden ended up going instead of Trump. So that's fairly different, again, than previous Republican presidents who were much more reticent to do that. And I think that it makes the Republicans, in a certain sense, more dangerous than they used to be, because the Democrats have kind of relied on the union support for a long time and said there's no alternative. If you let the Republicans win, they'll cut back all the union stuff. But there's a section of Republican-aligned think tanks who are advocating for an expanded role in certain ways for the unions, and also a whole bunch of other things, including like company unions and other nonsense like that. On the other hand, insofar as the Democrats do not have a monopoly on courting the unions, the argument that the working class can't risk independent political action or it will lose its supposed benefactor and patron in the Democrats is a lot weaker, because, it's so fucking obvious that it's bullshit, because both parties are trying to court the working class. And so it creates more openings for the working class and the unions to advance independent working class politics and to expose the reactionary union leaders who argue this isn't a possibility. there's a lot more to be said about that. But I think it's a great question about the Democrats and the Republicans and their relation to the unions.
So what do you think? Should communists advocate for either the Democrats or the Republicans? Kind of this argument that, well, it might be a little bit easier for us to organize under revolution, under democratic rule or Republican rule. What is something you would say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite silly, people who make that sort of argument. Some people do it naively because they don't know better. Some people do it because they're consolidated opportunists tied in a million different ways to the bourgeoisie. But neither bourgeois party is going to provide anything meaningful for the working class. They will, it's the class struggle that drives forward the concessions that they grant when they grant them. And the key task right now is not to say, okay, if we support one party or another, we can get a little bit more here or there, but to clarify to the workers the need for independent working class politics. How exactly this proceeds is complicated. In certain countries, historically, it's taken the form first of the development of a electoral labor party with all its flaws. And people, I think reasonably in the US, we have this electoral politics. It's so gross and corrupt. It is. But we should remember in Britain, the formation of the Labour Party was hailed by Lenin actually as an important step forward for the working class movement, despite all the flaws in the Labour Party. And when that party was formed, an electoral party, he said, okay, this is a good thing because it shows the crisis of legitimacy amongst the ruling class. There's openings for communists here. And he argued that communists in Britain should try to affiliate with the party, maintain organizational independence, but support the Labour Party conditionally, and then either be able to support it, work within it, and then win people over to communist politics from it and show them the need to go further, especially the more backwards masses who had faith in the electoral system and need to be shown via their own experience. Or if the communists were rejected and kicked out of this Labour Party, to use that as an exposure of the limitations of the Labour Party. And so the CPUSA and many other parties existing in conditions of bourgeois democracy followed the directives of the Comintern, Stalin, and others that argued they should try to help and assist in the formation of a Labour Party in their own countries. So it's an important question for us in the US to take stock of, if that can be a favorable thing to do. And we shouldn't a priori close the door on that. We can't just automatically rule that out and say, no, that's electoral politics. There's no hope for it. Of course, there's no hope of winning working class power and establishing socialism through elections. But the bourgeois parliament or the Congress in the US, it can be a tool that we can use. Now, it's a bourgeois state institution, but we could use it as a platform. We can use the elections to expose the limitations of elections. And that's really worth studying and thinking about. I won't get into it too much more than that here, but I think that whole framework shows there's no basis to support the Republicans or the Democrats. And these arguments, maybe the NLRB will be a little better under Biden versus Trump. It's really silly, and I think shows a lack of understanding of the basics of Marxism.
Yeah, I know you said you don't want to get into it, but you did name the Labour Party. So you've basically set yourself up, because I think there is lots of confusions amongst communists as well. Even for myself, this is really a question I've been digging more into a couple of months ago. And really it was only after a careful reread of left-wing communism by Lenin that I was like, okay, electoral politics, elections, it's a very complicated topic, especially in the US, with how many resources go to it, how it drains pretty much everything. And it's also a text that's usually kind of step to the side. It's its own whole monster. So I don't think we really need to get into electoralism, if it's strategically viable, and if so, what role it would play. But I do think it would be helpful to clarify just this one point, where you basically are putting forth that it makes sense for communists to align. Could also be helpful to hear a bit more with what align here means, for communists to align with the Labour Party, but not with the Democratic Party. But why is that? What's that difference all about?
Yeah, well, first, I should just be clear. Like, if you look in Britain right now, the Labour Party, it's a bourgeois party. It's not a working class party. But what I'm talking about is the development in the working class movement of a movement for independent political action of a class. So once the working class comes into being as a class, really exists as a separate thing, not just a kind of some guildsmen and so on, but really exists as a proletariat doing significant amounts of a significant number of people doing wage labor. And once the struggles of the working class against the capitalists intensify to a certain point, there arises an awareness of the need for independent political action of the working class. Now, the ultimate kind of expression of that under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie is the proletarian revolution. But for a long time, kind of before that, there's a lot of steps that need to be taken. The fight for an 8-hour workday, the fight against discrimination, like racial discrimination, etc. And in order for the working class to grow and develop and mature as a class, it has to constitute itself into a force capable of forcing the bourgeoisie to meet certain demands. Now, one form this has taken historically is within the electoral realm. The Labour Party, as it developed in Britain, was really based amongst the unions there. And despite all of its flaws, it was a very important step forward in the working class movement to fight for independent action in Parliament, to fight for reforms and for working class interests. And that actually came because of a break that the working class had, and the union leaders, even the reactionary union leaders, had with the Liberal Party in Britain. And so we could see a similar possibility developing here in the United States. And I'm not saying it's imminent, but where the betrayals of the working class time and time again by the Democrats encourages people to push for a break. And I was in attendance at Labor Notes, which is a event run by some Trots that has people from unions all across the country. And the Trotskyists who run it politically, that they're quite backwards. But one of the questions that came up over and over and over again, there's thousands of people there, was this question of the Labour Party. And actually, the workers who are taking on resolutions around Palestine and their unions, who are fighting against corrupt union leadership and a million other things, who were in attendance, and most of them unconsolidated to any political trend. When this question of the Labour Party came up, there was over and over again overwhelming support for it amongst the workers there. Now, that doesn't mean we're close, but it gives you a sense of the popular sentiment that there should be an independent party that fights for the working class interests. Now, we know as communists that ultimately, in order to achieve the working class interests, namely the interest in establishment of socialism, that can't happen through elections. We need revolution. And therefore, we need a communist vanguard party. But for a significant section of the working class, even once there exists a communist vanguard party, under the conditions of bourgeois democracy, many will still believe that maybe the electoral system can win them the changes they need, in particular the more intermediate and backward sections of the working class. And so people need to see through their own experience that that's not true. And that's what Lenin really emphasizes, why in certain circumstances it makes sense to support the creation of a Labour Party and to support its actions. That doesn't mean in every circumstances. And there's many circumstances, including right now in the US, where it just doesn't make sense for communists to undertake electoral efforts. But at certain points, in certain contexts, it does. And what exactly those look like, it's complicated. But the basic thing, really is that you have to use the parliament as a pulpit to advocate and fight for revolution, and to fight illusions within the parliamentary or the congressional system, not to promote them. And that's the fundamental dividing line between the revisionist approach to parliamentary politics and electoral politics and the communist approach. And the Comintern is very clear on this matter. It is a shame, actually, that there's not more clarity on this right now in the US and around the world.
Yeah, and that's a very helpful breakdown. And I also appreciate this focus on where are we at now as a revolutionary movement. It's very, very important to not just take things dogmatically from past movements, and we can go in either direction of that. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot that's been figured out. There's a lot that's been spelled out. But to really focus on what are our immediate aims currently. And, for communists, right? The most important thing is, if can't have revolution without a communist party, we should probably build up a communist party. That could be pretty important. But some other random man had asked before, when you were still talking about the struggle between the giants, between Trump and Biden, as they're going toe to toe. So if the ruling class is willing to put its own factions in prison, does that say they are stronger or weaker now as a class?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think weaker, definitively. They're worried about their class rule. They're weaker both geopolitically and globally than they were in the 90s when they were the uncontested and sole superpower, and they're weaker domestically. They have to spend more and more of their resources and energy towards fighting their rivals and also to keeping their allies in line. Because you can see this, like, for example, with Macron going on and on about strategic autonomy and the need for Europe to have more independence from the US and so on. That's a sign of the decline of US imperialism. That it's kind of, I guess France isn't really a junior imperialist partner, but subordinate imperialist allies are trying to get more wiggle room, more independence, and so on. And so, yeah, I think they're definitively weaker. I think we should be square, though. They're still very strong. And of course, the reactionaries are a paper tiger, but we have to remember they have a real aspect of a tiger and also an aspect of paper. And the US ruling class is still quite powerful. Things are still quite stable here compared to many other countries, even compared to how things were historically. So we do, unfortunately, have a long way to go to revolution in this country, but that doesn't mean things are hopeless. And that does not mean, by any stretch of the imagination, that we have no tasks in front of us to do. And to answer this question you just brought up, yeah, I mean, a big part of what's happening right now is the ruling class is scrambling because of their lack of proper preparation for a serious inter-imperialist conflict with China, which, even short of world war, the US is not ready to seriously go toe-to-toe with China. And in a certain sense, China is not ready to go toe-to-toe with the US. There has never, in the entire history of capitalism, been a situation where the two great powers in the world are so economically intertwined, and especially not in the capitalist imperialist era. Like when the US and the social imperialist Soviet Union were going toe-to-toe, economically, they were almost totally disconnected. But you have a situation where the US ruling class is dependent upon China for a huge amount of the goods that are produced there, or that are purchased and consumed here. Not just military stuff, not just computer stuff, basic medicine, a huge amount of consumer goods. And on the other hand, you have a situation where China and the Chinese ruling class is dependent upon the sale of hundreds of billions of dollars of goods to the US market. And what happens if the capitalists can't sell their goods? They go out of business. And who can China sell those goods to if not the US? The Chinese capitalists, they can't sell those internally in China. They don't have the domestic market, and that's strong enough to do that. They can't sell those goods to Africa. There's not enough consumption and demand there. They can't sell it to Russia or even to Europe. And there's more and more tariffs being put on Chinese goods in Europe. So both the Chinese and the US ruling class are in a pickle. And the US ruling class in particular is, well, they're both unprepared in certain ways, but the US ruling class is really kind of realizing right now kind of like how unprepared they are. And that's tied into this whole conflict amongst them, as I was saying earlier.
That point is really important about how intertwined and interconnected it is. And it's helpful to really think about the shifts that the capitalist imperialist system went through. Really, the shift from colonies to neo-colonies, where basically India, for example, used to be a colony of Great Britain, and pretty much, that there was the British export of capital to India, and British mining of the resources of India, right? Other imperialist powers didn't have access in that same way. Then there's a shift to neo-colonies, where, for example, if you take a country like the Philippines, is kind of open to the exploitation of both American imperialism and Chinese imperialism, mainly American imperialism, but Chinese imperialism as well, which really complicates things because that really leads to this intertwining of different economies in terms of access to other oppressed countries, but also to production of of things like semiconductors, for example. Well, where are we going to get the resources for, and how do we deal with potential threats? Or what if China takes on Taiwan? How does that then change the access of the U.S. to semiconductors? So, Thomas, I was wondering if you could spell that out a bit more. Kind of this interconnectedness, this which leads to different proposals from the ruling class, because there's, for example, this China plus one idea where, sure, yes, okay, we need to disconnect. There's the threat from China. It's terrible. But what if we keep a little bit in China and then we'll just diversify our production outside of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let me say this. The conflict between Biden and Trump is very much indicative of this precise division amongst the U.S. ruling class. Now, Trump's camp and Biden's camp are themselves both divided. But Trump, I think, is rapidly gaining popularity amongst the ruling class. And since his conviction actually raised like record amounts of money, a huge number of ruling class members who previously were not supporting him have shifted to support him. Big people, Bill Ackman, Steven Schwartzman, and so on. So these are not insignificant players by any means in the ruling class who are now supporting Trump. I think they're primarily supporting Trump because they see Biden's not effective. I mean, literally, he's not there, obviously, for those who've been following it. He's mentally not there. But his administration, the people who are calling the shots, really are not effective. And this China plus one question is the perfect example. So the so-called brains behind the Biden administration is really especially Jake Sullivan, who's the national security advisor to the Biden administration. I say so-called brains because he's kind of an idiot. For example, he published an article in Foreign Affairs 3 weeks before October 7th, saying Biden's greatest foreign policy accomplishment was the unprecedented peace and stability that Biden had brought to the Middle East. 3 weeks before October 7th. I mean, what a fool. But Sullivan doesn't just publish stupid pieces in Foreign Affairs. He also crafts a lot of Biden's trade and economic policy. Him and Lyle Brainerd, who's on the head of the Fed, and they jointly he's on the board of the Fed. And Brainerd and Sullivan jointly head Biden's logistics committee that's dealing with these plans for avoiding a logistics crisis like we saw in the beginning of COVID. Have crafted a lot of what's called the China plus one policy. So China plus one means that existing U.S. businesses, which have the majority of their production in China, will continue to have the majority of their production in China, but will develop a plus one to China, shift some portion of their production to Vietnam or to Indonesia or to the Philippines or to India. And the idea is if there's a crisis over Taiwan or something else like that, which China absolutely could take and could go for, there's various factors there that could push China to really go to, seize Taiwan at present. And Taiwan's a very complicated issue. You could argue retake Taiwan because it was part of China before and so on. But I won't get into that right now. But if China were to go for aggressive military action towards Taiwan or even just blockade the island, you would expect retaliatory sanctions from the U.S. and a bunch of companies that produce goods in China would then have to not produce them so much in China. The belief with China plus one is that these companies could quickly scale up production in Vietnam or India or Malaysia or wherever to replace their production in China. It's a pipe dream. It takes years to scale up production. Orders of magnitude, double, triple, increase production 10 times. You've got to figure out the shipping. You've got to get your supply chains right from the suppliers. You've got to deal with all the regulations in the country. You've got to train up skilled workers. You've got to build factories. There's no way you can do that in a 6-month period to replace the goods you would lose in that sort of situation where conflict with China escalates, conflict between the US and China escalates. And Space, I don't know if you want to jump in there. I've got more to say, but I'll keep going. Okay. So Sullivan's plan is kind of a mix of China +1 and then what he calls high fence, small yard. Now, high fence, small yard basically refers to there will be a small yard, a small section of U.S. production around key military matters, AI, quantum computing, advanced semiconductors, where the U.S. basically walls that off from China and builds a high fence around it. So most of the economy with the U.S. and China will stay as it is. There'll be a China +1. And then for some key things, the U.S. will make sure that those are only built in the U.S. or U.S. allied countries. But the problem is, if the means of production for producing these advanced semiconductors or military technologies, even some smaller portions of them, like the legacy semiconductors, the older chips, the bigger chips, or the raw materials, the rare earth metals, or whatever, come from China, then you can't really do a small yard with a high fence. It doesn't work. So this is really the proposal the Biden administration has. It's very akin to what Ursula von der Leyen in the EU is called the de-risking approach, which is reduce the risk to the European economy if things go bad with China. And it's true, as someone said in the chat, there's already a lot of European or Chinese goods in Europe, but Europe has been imposing some more aggressive tariffs on Chinese goods to prevent further entrance and more goods coming into the market. And the US has been doing the same. So there's no question amongst the ruling class about the need for more protectionism in the US, more tariffs, more shifting some production of China. It's a question of degree, which is a quantitative question, and then a qualitative question of what should the organizing principle be. And on the other side, with the Trump administration or the incoming Trump presidency, Trump loves to talk. Every time he gets a chance, he talks. Interview, put a camera in front of him, a microphone, reporter asks him a question, he'll just blabber on for forever. But whenever it comes to his trade policy, he doesn't talk so much. He talks a little bit, but then his campaign, he says, talk to Robert Lighthizer, who is the U.S. trade representative under Trump, which is a special office. You can look it up. It's kind of interesting. It's little known, but it's a very powerful government office. Lighthizer crafted the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement, which was the free trade deal that replaced NAFTA. And Lighthizer has been floated by Trump as the next Secretary of the Treasury should Trump win. Lighthizer advocates what he calls strategic decoupling, which is a rapid economic decoupling, basically over 4 years, the next Trump administration should Trump win, that will massively shift all key production the U.S. relies on in China out of China. Some will go to the U.S., some will go to Mexico, India, other places. But to try to do this very quickly. Now, they are aware, Lighthizer, Trump, and their people, this will be immensely painful for the U.S. ruling class. But the idea is it's this sort of pain now or a lot more pain later. And the idea is it will hurt China more. I'm not sure whether they're right about that or wrong about that. It's a very complicated question. But it's an idea which has increasingly gained popularity amongst a lot of the U.S. ruling class, that radical, fundamental transformation to the U.S.-China economic and therefore political relationship is rapidly needed, that the status quo leads to the U.S. imperialist defeat and Chinese imperialism's victory. And this is a huge, huge debate that's playing out amongst the U.S. ruling class, in which sadly is barely being discussed in the U.S. and especially in the U.S. left.
Yeah, it really changes this whole approach of, well, who's better for circumstances here, the Democrats or the Republicans, and rather looking at what are the concrete policies that are being fought over. How do different either parties or politicians within these parties relate to the conflict with China? Because the reality is that what we've seen historically is that world wars are breeding grounds for revolution. But if World War III would break out tomorrow, would we be ready? that's a question we need to ask, right? So we can't just approach it that clearly. So thanks for laying that out, Thomas. And I know that there's also been a question about the labor aristocracy, which I know will shift the focus of this conversation a bit. Are you good with that? Because I do think it's a very important question to go into.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. I'll just say we're going to be publishing a paper on this topic as MCU in a bit. I'm not sure exactly when. We've got a draft of it, but so keep an eye out for that if you're interested in diving more into this, because we've written fairly extensively on it and are excited to publish some analysis and hear what people think about it.
Love a good plug. So, Guy, yes, was curious to hear your thoughts on UE and labor aristocracy. So UE uneven, no, not uneven. UE
unequal exchange.
Unequal exchange, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, first, I want to just break down a few aspects of this question. It's a great question. I think these topics are commonly misunderstood. Lenin had an argument that really drew on Engels' argument that there was a very unique situation that existed in Britain in the late 19th century, that because of the industrial monopoly that Britain enjoyed in the world market in the latter half of the 19th century, that the British ruling class was able to bribe a large section of the organized workers, not the whole working class, but the organized workers, the unionized workers, and have them become a labor aristocracy. But that situation would likely never be possible again in the history of the world, given that other countries had industrialized at that point. And when Lenin talks about the labor aristocracy, he talks about a small stratum of the best paid unionized workers, and then the related union officials, the reactionary union officials who form this labor aristocracy. He doesn't mean all the workers in an imperialist country, and he certainly doesn't mean all the unionized workers. But there's this tendency amongst sections of third worldists or Sakaists to kind of label the entire working class in the US, or the entire white working class, or the entire unionized working class as a labor aristocracy. And it's just silly. I mean, if you look at, for example, workers at UPS, and then you look at the cost of living. So, for example, in New York City, according to a cost of living calculator, a living wage is $42 an hour. And that's, if both partners in if like two parents and two kids, that's the family, nuclear family, whatever. Each partner needs to be making $42 an hour to have a living wage. Now, living wage, we should be square, is getting the value of your labor power. And at the very end of the UPS contract, in 4 years from now, the UPS drivers will make $42 an hour. So the cost of living will almost certainly continue to rise in New York City. So even at that point, the drivers for UPS will be under the cost of living. So you can get a sense of what I'm driving at here. There are some workers in New York City who are unionized, some of the construction workers, who total benefits, everything included, do make more than the living wage. And then you could debate, are they labor aristocratic, or are they just skilled workers who enjoy a higher standard of living? It's complex. It's worth debating. There certainly is labor aristocracy in the US, but where you draw that line is something of a debate. My point in referencing this is just to emphasize the working class in the US doesn't enjoy a standard of living where they're being paid far more than the value of their labor power on average, even the unionized workers. If you look at the majority of workers at UPS, the warehouse workers, they're getting like 20 something an hour under their current contract, which in most cities and towns in the US is fairly below the living wage or the cost of their labor power. Now, what happens with these discussions on unequal exchange is that the picture gets all distorted because of a lack of familiarity with basic political economy, or a kind of dishonest distortion by a series of revisionist academics who people sometimes draw on without themselves being dishonest. Let me explain. Okay, so the argument sometimes goes that there's unequal exchange between imperialist and oppressed countries, and that's the material basis for a huge labor aristocracy, and that's why workers and people, even poor people, enjoy a higher standard of living in imperialist countries than oppressed countries. This isn't a Marxist analysis, and it's not a Marxist analysis for a few different reasons. The first is that when we talk about socially necessary labor time, we are talking about the amount of time necessary to produce a given commodity, including labor power, in a given country at a given period of time. For example, in Capital, Marx contrasts that the habits of British and French workers, noting the British workers drink beer and French workers drink wine, and that this is a contributing factor to the different socially necessary labor times for the production of their labor power, and therefore some plays a factor in the differential wages they receive. So we have to consider that there is a world market, and there are certain commodities which have world prices, gold in particular, but also oil. I mean, now the oil market's kind of bifurcated, but for a long time, the Brent oil price was the oil price. Now you've got the Brent, and then you've got the West Texas Intermediary because of the shale revolution, as they've called it here in the US. And you also have the Russian oil price varying with the sanctions on Russia and so on. But there are certain commodities which have a world price because of their ubiquity in the global economy. Gold as the money commodity, oil given the use in it for energy production and so on. But most commodities have different prices in different markets. And these prices reflect the different socially necessary labor times to produce these goods. So goods produced in the US, where there's a much higher organic composition of capital, a much greater degree of capital-intensive industries, and therefore a much greater degree of efficiency in production in terms of the amount of labor that's needed to produce a good is much less. Labor productivity is much higher, is another way of saying it. Goods can be produced for much cheaper. So in terms of the amount of goods that people have in their daily lives, they're often, the standard of living is higher because of that in part, and also in part because of imperialism. But you have to consider the factor of labor productivity. And this is actually something I was talking about with Fred Angst, who we're going to be publishing an interview with him shortly. That part of the conversation isn't in the interview, but it's a point he was making in talking about this question of unequal exchange. So we have to first look at those differential labor productivities in different countries in order to get a sense of what we're talking about when we're looking at unequal exchange. The second piece of the picture, though, is, of course, unequal exchange does happen, but it's grossly overstated by a series of third worldists. Now, what do I mean? Well, Marx talks about in Capital, in volume 2 and 3, about the formation of the average rate of profit, that basically equal capital invested needs to yield roughly average rate of profit. Capitalists who have an opportunity to invest in a booming new industry yielding a higher rate of profit will invest there. That rate of profit will fall as supply and demand equalize, and then that will be average. And so once you have the rise of imperialism, you have a situation where you have actually not the average rate of profit, but monopoly profits, where the big monopoly companies make a higher than average rate of profit insofar as other companies receive a lower than average rate of profit, or insofar as members of the working class and the petty bourgeoisie overpay for goods. And so this is a reality, actually, that the monopolies are able to sell their goods for a higher than the average rate of profit, and others then therefore get a lower than average rate of profit. But the vast majority of the exploitation of the oppressed countries does not happen in the form of unequal exchange, but rather in the super profits that the capitalists are able to get from their capital export to these countries. So hopefully that's helpful to clarify some of how I see this situation.
Yeah, I think if you could address that that comment that living wage does not equal workers receiving all their labor value, but then there's also it means a wage above their long-term replacement wage, aka total immiseration.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure what the second part means, but in terms of them not receiving their labor value, what I said was that they receive the full value of their labor power. So the labor power is the ability to do work. It's a commodity. So Marx's analysis of capital and how capitalism works is based on distinguishing between labor, which is the act of consciously producing a good, a use value, and the labor power, the ability to do labor. Workers don't sell their labor, they sell their labor power. And insofar as the definition of value is the amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce a given commodity, actually labor has no value, because value is by definition a measurement of an amount of time of labor on average, in the economy. And so workers who receive the full value of their labor power are being paid a wage sufficient to reproduce their ability to do work and to show up at work and to produce the next generation of workers, which is still far, far, far less than the amount of value they produce. We might say that, let's take a simple example. Let's say workers produce $100 of value in a day of work. And obviously it's much more, but we'll just take the simple numbers to make it easy, or $1,000 of value, or whatever we want to say. And okay, let's say workers produce $1,000 of value in a day, and they get paid $100 a day. Now, that $100 a day, if that's enough for them to live and reproduce and so on, then that may well be the value of their labor power. That's the value of all the goods and services needed for them to exist as a worker ready to work. But that's not the value they produce. And capitalist exploitation is contingent upon that difference between the value of labor power and the value that workers produce in a given workday. So hopefully that helps to clarify that.
So how about, this, okay, because then that raises the question, okay, well, if basically almost no workers are able to really even reproduce themselves based on how much money they get, what's keeping all this going? And so there can be this idea of like, well, okay, American workers might not make as much, but they have all this access to debt, right? They could just kind of continue to tack on all these credit cards and stuff. So where does that situate in your arguments?
Well, I would just use an artistic response and tell people check out the Space Baby song "Damn 'Em in Debt." No, but I think it's a great song. But just to say, like, if you've ever had a lot of debt, student loans, credit card debt, etc., it's not really a sustainable thing. I mean, you can kind of keep taking on more debt for a time, but eventually the chickens come home to roost, right? And you go bankrupt. So having more access to debt is it's complicated because it can allow people to temporarily enjoy a higher standard of living, but ultimately it's actually a secondary form of exploitation, a way in which the capitalists are able to basically drive down the standard of living of the workers overall by ensuring access to their future wages. So, I mean, I think those arguments, just like people who make them generally aren't so familiar with what it's like to be in just a hell of a lot of debt.
Yeah, I envy these people.
Yeah, student loans, man,
Well, that is, I will say, growing up in the Netherlands, I feel like that's my one up against American society.
Yeah.
Where when I built up my credit here, I've been congratulated on my credit, but that's because I don't have $1 million in student debt. So that is an important piece of the pie. But I mean, these questions are really great. We really need to figure this stuff out, and it really shows the importance of studying political economy, which really is in relation to scientific socialism and philosophy, really understudied, just because it can be daunting. And you learn about one concept, and then you learn about one thing, and I have to learn 10 other things, and then you learn 10 other things, and you forgot what the first thing was. So it is this foundation that really builds upon itself. But once you understand a couple of these concepts, it can be much easier to just build up more knowledge after you have the foundation, which of course is true for any area of knowledge, but with political economy, even more so. And so really appreciate these questions. And there is a question here which would we're always going to shout out fundamentals of political economy. It's put that out. It is challenging. Definitely recommend people getting to study group, to study this stuff collectively, but it's just such a great primer. Now, there is a question that would take us away from both the ruling class shenanigans and this whole question of third worldism. So I did want to check in with you, Thomas, if there is anything else you wanted to bring up about this topic.
Well, let me just say one more thing on this labor aristocracy question before we move on. Because, look, there is a labor aristocracy in the US and in imperialist countries generally. And as I mentioned, these are like the best paid stratum of the working unionized workers and the union officials. But the question is, what does that mean in terms of strategy and tactics? And I think what Lenin argues in Left-Wing Communism, which is a text that historically has been just ignored in the US, partially because the RCP's line on it, that was kind of not a good text. We have to drive these opportunists, chauvinists, and reactionary leaders of the unions out of the unions, or split off the workers from the unions if that's the way it has to go. And sometimes it will go that way. And ultimately have the communists take leadership over those unions and those worker struggles. It's the only way. And generally, there's a feeling in line with the kind of German left communists that Lenin was critiquing, of saying, oh, that's all hopeless. We got to just make pure red unions from the beginning, or pure red workers organizations. That's the only way that we can do it. It's tainted by the reformism and backwardsness of the official unions. But who are you going to bring into those? Even at the height of like red unionism in the US with IWW, they struggled to have more than a few tens of thousands of members compared to the millions in the union movement, the official union movement. So you're basically abandoning all those workers, and it's a real mistake. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yes, it absolutely is. And I think this is a conversation, or some of these topics are going to continue to come up, and I think it could be helpful maybe for a future live stream to just completely get into this question of political economy in relation to third worldism. I think that could be very helpful, because I see some other random man putting forward some more things. We could kind of continue this back and forth, but I think this should really be its session on its own, because I think we really need to break down the basics of these concepts in order to do this justice and not talk past each other. And I think we'll go on for about 10 minutes more. And so hopefully we can tackle this the last 10 minutes. But it is a very spicy one, because this would require a breakdown of the situation in Palestine, the relationship of the struggle for Palestinian liberation to the Israeli working class. So if you would want to tackle this, Thomas, a guy asked, what are Thomas' thoughts on the kibbutz movement and labor Zionism? Does he find any hope for settler workers going against the Zionist settler colony?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's an important debate that's happening. Unfortunately, I think not quite enough debate happening on this question. In the U.S. right now, there's a tendency kind of for people to talk past each other. But yeah, I mean, so in terms of the original kibbutz movement and stuff, I think it's by and large a reactionary movement, right? You can't build socialism or socialist type things that way. And anyways, like kind of it's utopian socialism that people had in mind, but you can't build that it can't be a progressive thing when you're literally driving people off their land at gunpoint. In terms of the Israeli population taking a stand against the Zionism, I think basically the people who choose to go to Israel and live in Israel and join up with that project, there's very little chance any of them will do that. I mean, they've made a conscious political decision to go and support this basically, fascist, ethno-supremacist state. And this was also actually a topic that I had a great conversation with Fred on this question. But in terms of the people who are born there, I think it's more divided. There is a lot of poverty in Israel. You can see a subsection of actually very religious Jewish people in Israel going against going against the Israeli state and going against Zionism. There's a Twitter page, is called Torah Judaism, I think, and you can see there a section of people, like they're a minority, but they like literally in the Jerusalem and elsewhere, they're Jewish. They're putting up Palestinian flags and fighting very strongly against the police, and really being brutalized by the Israeli police. And so you can see there the basis for that sort of thing to develop. That doesn't mean it will. And there's obviously an immense chauvinism being promoted by the Israeli ruling class. Right now, these sort of sections that are actually taking a strong stand against Zionism and really standing with the Palestinian people are a small minority, and they may remain that way. But the contradictions amongst the Israeli ruling class, the anger at Netanyahu and kind of Likud, it creates openings for more such dissent. There has for a long time been a low level of dissent, and you can see it with kind of outstanding people like oh my God, he wrote I'm forgetting his name for a second. He wrote the History of Modern Palestine. Let me look his name up. Hold on. Sorry. Because it's relevant. Ilan Pappé, sorry. Yeah, I mean, he's born an Israeli citizen, I believe, and taking just incredibly strong stand against Zionism. They're a small minority, though. And barring major unexpected changes in the short term, I don't think that there will be a large-scale movement of the Israeli population against the Israeli state. Unfortunately, I just doesn't seem like that's on the horizon. What seems to be more likely is the protest against certain aspects of the Israeli state policy, some of the corruption, but also there's some of these protests against Netanyahu are protests against his supposed lack of effectiveness in carrying out the genocide. So that's not obviously a progressive protest. So it doesn't look like there's anything in the short term that will lead to a large scale mass protest. But insofar as we see these things, like people who are born and raised in Israel, who are devoutly religious in certain cases, standing strongly with the Palestinian people, willing to fight tooth and nail, physically fight against the Israeli police, to wave a Palestinian flag, to have one hang over their home, you can see the basis for this sort of thing to exist and to potentially grow. Again, I don't think it's likely that will grow in the short term, but I think it can expand potentially. In terms of the resistance of the Palestinian people, I think that's the main driving force right now. And it's quite heroic what the Palestinian people are doing and how they've been fighting back. It's also a very difficult situation. In terms of, I see Guy asked a follow-up question about the kind of their plans for attrition. I'm not sure how it will shake out. I mean, Israel has openly kind of declared that they will open a northern front now against Hezbollah. And it seems likely Israel hopes to have this be a quick kind of shock and awe type war. But if the last war they fought in Lebanon is any indication, Israel will probably run out of bombs before they're able to defeat Hezbollah. I don't think they will be able to secure a meaningful victory there. And this could lead to much deeper crisis in Israeli society. And it could even potentially lead to the collapse of the Israeli state, although I don't think that's in the short term. But the situation's unstable, so it's unclear. I will say this, though, which is that, I went to some events where people were talking about, and I'm not saying you're saying this, guy, but I saw some people saying it's okay. The Palestinian people, people have been through genocide before; they can handle that again. And Arabs have faced a lot of genocides; they're resilient. People are certainly resilient, but the price the Palestinian people are paying now for their very existence as Palestinian, and the brutality with which the Israeli fascist forces are just attacking them is quite hard to see. And we know as communists that these are sort of the crimes the capitalists and the imperialists commit, but it's intense devastation the Palestinian people are facing. And I hope the resistance can continue to stay strong and ultimately defeat the Israeli forces and win liberation in this fight. But it is a very, very tough situation. And sometimes that's understated, just how challenging it is right now, because people see the heroic resistance of the Palestinian people and draw a lot of inspiration from it, rightly so. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this is a tremendously difficult situation that the Palestinians are facing. We don't want to fall into nihilism, but we can't ignore that reality either.
You handled both those questions a lot faster than I thought. I'm impressed. I thought you're just going to be like, oh yeah, let me just touch on this, and we would be 30 minutes ahead. But we talked about a lot today. Talked about the student encampments, and I threw that about China, petty bourgeois radicalism, some of the different class forces, the way that the bourgeoisie is trying is offering distorted versions of Marxism, getting to ruling class shenanigans, Trump, Biden, Hunter Biden, Lil Wayne even, and then getting into unequal exchange and the labor aristocracy and neoliberalism and neo-mercantilism. Go ahead.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Lil Wayne was once again put in jail for gun charges in 2020, and that one of his last acts or maybe convicted or was going through the process, one of Trump's last acts on his last day of office was to pardon Lil Wayne. Little known fact. I found that out like 2 days ago.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful, crazy world we live in. And it's all here on Marxism today. So thank you everybody for watching. And also, people like some other random man to really, put forward these perspectives and being willing to struggle. I know it can be, talk about unequal exchange. We're here with the platform with all the control, and you're in the comments. It's a very unequal struggle, of course. So we recognize that. So I think that makes it all the more great for people to kind of go against the tide and continue to put forward these things, so we can genuinely struggle for more unity on these topics, because we're not just discussing this stuff because they're interesting ideas. We're really trying to make revolution here, which is a long process. It's a long and arduous process that takes a lot of theoretical clarifications. We have to understand the laws of the world around us so we can intervene. That's the whole point. We're trying to understand how all these things work so we can intervene in them. That's the beauty of a scientific approach. We're not trying to understand these things just for understanding sake. So really appreciate everybody going crazy in the chat, and already looking forward to the next one. Thomas, do you want to sing us out?
Unfortunately, singing is not one of my musical abilities, but I will say, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for all the comments, the questions. There's a lot of really good questions. Sorry to anyone whose question we didn't get to, but tune in again in the future and we'll try to get to those at that point. And I'm really looking forward to doing, it will have to wait, unfortunately, until this fall, but a number of videos on political economy specifically, some more basic concepts and some more advanced ones. And we have a number of exciting interviews coming up. I mentioned the one with Fred Angst that we'll be posting shortly, as well as we'll be posting a series of interviews with Professor Gian Sai Baba, who was recently freed from prison in India. So keep a lookout for those, and those will be up in the next few weeks.
That's right. And now to sing us out, I'm going to sing The East is Red. Dong Fang Hong Tai Yang